Welcome to FACT's webinar called Best Practices for Pastured Poultry Health, Production, and Profit, presented by Mike Badger with the American Pastured Poultry Producers Association. This webinar is hosted by Food Animal Concerns Trust or FACT. I am Larissa McKenna, FACT's Humane Farming Program Director, and I will be moderating the webinar this evening. Thank you all for joining us. It is certainly a pleasure to have you here. So just a few quick introductions. Food Animal Concerns Trust or FACT is a national nonprofit organization. We are headquartered in Chicago, and we promote the safe and humane production of meat, milk, and eggs. It's a picture of me, so you can put a name to a face. I direct FACT's Humane Farming Program, which provides a number of opportunities for livestock and poultry farmers. For example, we are currently accepting our applications for our Fund to Farmer grants, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the grants at the end of the webinar. FACT also facilitates peer-to-peer farmer education to increase the number of animals that are raised humanely, and this webinar is part of our Humane Farming webinar series. So please visit our website, which I have listed, to learn more about our farmer services and to apply for a grant or to register for a future webinar. At this time, I'm honored to introduce our esteemed presenter, Mike Badger. Mike is the director of the American Pastured Poultry Producers Association, or APPPA for short. Along with his family, he operates Badger's Millside Farm in Pennsylvania. And I'm honored that Mike is with us tonight to share some of his recommendations for successfully raising poultry in pasture. He will be available to answer your questions later on in the webinar. So at this point, I am going to hand the virtual mic over to Mike so that he may start his presentation. With that, Mike, please take it away.
Hey, good evening, Larissa, and good evening, everyone. First, thank you for allowing me to come on today or tonight and talk about pastured poultry. It's one of the things I find myself doing quite often, obviously. And as we jump in and get started here, we're going to talk a little bit about suggested practices for pastured poultry health, production, and profit, because one of the things that we do at APPPA is we really focus on the pastured poultry as a business model. And I realize some folks may be primarily raising pastured poultry to feed their families, but the ideas and the things that I talk about tonight will kind of be applicable to everybody across the spectrum. And a little bit about me, you've heard the big items there. I do work with the American Pastured Poultry Producers Association. We just call it APPPA, is how we pronounce that acronym. It's a whole lot easier to say. And I have a Pastured Poultry Talk podcast, and I do some of my own pastured poultry on my farm. But primarily these days, my emphasis is APPPA. That's the driving force of my time. And so what are we going to talk about here, and what are these pastured poultry best practices? I got to be honest with you, when I hear the word best practices, I kind of cringe a little bit. But really what we're talking about here is kind of the foundational items of what it takes to successfully raise pastured poultry. One of the analogies that I always like to bring about and use is a sports team. When you have a football team, since it is football season, and a team is performing poorly, they're losing, oftentimes you hear the coach say, we need to get back to basics. We need to tackle, we need to pay attention, we need to practice hard. Those basics. And when I think about the best practices, that's kind of what I'm thinking about here, is just getting back to those basic keystone ideas that leverage natural poultry behaviors. They don't tie you into doing stuff that blocks your creativity. So these are just things that will get you a healthy, profitable poultry, chicken, broiler, turkey, egg, whatever the case may be. And the items I'm going to pull out here tonight to share with you are really just kind of experiences, right? A lot of it's distilled from the APPPA community of producers, personal experience, a lot of time talking with other experts, and I always try to find myself in the room with the smartest people that I can, the people that are smarter than me. And I think that's pretty important when you're when you're trying to get good or learn about something is you always seek out the people who know more than you, and you tag on to them and engage with them and have that conversation. And that's really one of the awesome parts of APPPA is that community aspect. So as we go through tonight, just know I want to leave a lot of time on the back end for questions. I do spend a lot of time answering questions. I may not have all of those answers when the question time comes, but I'm accessible and we can continue the conversation later. But we're gonna move through these items so that we leave a lot of time for that Q&A, and you'll have the reference material here in the webinar replay. Okay, Larissa, if you would like to play our video. We're going to watch a short clip here. It's about 30 seconds. This is a trailer for an upcoming video project that we have. And you guys are kind of seeing this for the first time. It hasn't been out yet. And so we'll watch it and then we'll talk about it, and we'll use that to launch into our presentation.
Pastured poultry is chickens were raised in as natural environment as you can, and for us that means putting them out here right here on the pasture with daily moves, so they have constant access to fresh pasture, bugs, grass, scratching in the dirt, doing things that make a chicken a chicken.
Other people, they portray themselves as us. We don't do a good job of marketing who we are, and the ones that don't do what we do a good job of marketing that they do it like us.
Okay. Thank you, Larissa. So I apologize for the pixelation on the video. We couldn't solve that problem. It will be clear on the replay, and this will be out there for public consumption here in the next day or so, and then our full feature film coming soon. So those characters you saw on the screen, the first one was David Hale, the second one was Terrell Spencer, both APPPA board members and Pastured Poultry producers. So this is obviously setting up a video, a message to consumers about what makes pastured poultry different than all those other things. And that really, from a producer standpoint, that difference starts with a lot of the things that we're going to talk about tonight. So, as we think about this, what is pastured poultry, right? We have to hang our hat here. Unfortunately, there's so many confusing pieces in the chicken landscape nowadays that we have to actually be very intentional in how we define pastured poultry when we talk to other farmers and other consumers. And you heard it there in that short intro. Pastured poultry is movement. It's continuously moving to fresh pasture. This is the foundation that gives you the healthy chicken, that lets you raise it without antibiotics, but builds the soil health without damaging the pasture. It's seasonally appropriate. Broilers, in the north, they have a season. They shut down in the winter, in the late fall, and the hens come inside. In the south, in places like Florida, the off season for broilers might be July and August. So there's seasonality to it, and we have to think that it's different than some of the other labels that we find. Interestingly enough, today I had a phone call from a conventional chicken grower who has 8 barns on his farms, and they're too old. He can't get more contracts until he upgrades. And that's about a $2 million note. So he's trying to figure out how he can get on this organic free range bandwagon. And, clearly would be difficult to set up a pastured operation with that infrastructure. But one of the things that he said really struck me was that he just needs to make money. And his reason for seeking out me and organic and whatever else you might think was to make money. And that's kind of that's not really the driving force of our membership and of our community right now. There's an ideal here, and it builds on this idea that there's a better way to raise poultry. And we know we won't belabor the organic point. Just know that organic means something, but a lot of times that chicken is raised in nearly identical conditions to the conventional poultry. They just swap out some feed. And free range doesn't mean birds are outside. There just means that they had some doors to the outside. So I always like to say that we expect pastured poultry to live outside. That is the expectation. There is no assumption. It's out there as the season is appropriate. And pastured poultry is always cage-free. Every single day of the year, pastured poultry eggs are always from cage-free hens. And so this is, obviously, that's a little bit of some marketing as we get going, but that's how we should be thinking about this. When you look at all these terms floating around there, we got to figure out why we're different and be able to articulate it. And that's part of what this video that we just watched and the larger version will be driving at. We'll be promoting that difference in a very upbeat and positive way. So now we come back down to kind of the nuts and bolts here, the things where most of our producers really excel at is the production side, and this idea of how do you raise a bird so that it's healthy, happy, and profitable and nutritious, right? And one of those things begets the other. A healthy bird is going to naturally be a pleasant eating experience and nutritious, and it's going to be profitable because it's going to perform to your expectations. So all these things are interrelated, and if you're just raising a few birds for yourself, then being able to raise a healthy bird that meets expectations is also important. Just because you don't sell birds doesn't mean that you want to, do it in an inefficient way. So we're going to start in the brooder. We're going to work through some of these core ideas and talk really about some of the things that are intentionally different about raising pastured poultry, or some of the things that our producers do that actually have some influence in our final product. So, I know we're in fall here. I'm in Pennsylvania. We're heading into fall, which we'll probably just skip and go straight to winter. But as I think to the spring, people are closing down their brooders now. Their broilers are coming out, the last batch. But in the spring, in my neck of the woods, March is usually when people bring in their first batch of meat birds to the brooder. And I used to do a lot of on-farm processing. I had a mobile unit, and I had a customer that I went to every week. And when you bring birds in the beginning of March in my neck of the woods, you're playing with the weather. It's going to either be cold, hot, or just right. And it's very infrequently just right. It's a volatile time of year. So I had a customer who, it was cold and sustained cold, but he had birds in the brooder. So he buttoned up the brooder, just took the whole thing, closed it all up, made it airtight, perfect. Well, guess what? His birds started dying. They didn't gain weight. They looked sickly, and his solution was to treat them with some kind of antibiotic, rather than seek out help from people who could have helped him. He went a different route, but his problem was caused by, bad brooder management, and brooder management really sets the tone for the rest of your bird's life. If you mess up the brooder, all your rest of your grow out will be bad as well. And so speaking there to the point of ventilation, you always want to have ventilation in your brooder in every single weather condition, which is what I'm trying to illustrate with when I talk about that producer. Because you need to exchange that air inside the brooder. And if you walk in there and it's stuffy and, you can feel the air, that's really, really bad. You don't like it. Your birds don't like it. And that's the idea of ammonia, right? Because you'll really also start to build up ammonia. And ammonia is a really tricky thing. Many of us think that we can smell ammonia problems. And by the time you smell it, it's almost always over the limit. We don't smell ammonia till it's about 25 parts per million. If you were to test the air quality there for ammonia, and it causes damage and respiratory damage at about 10 parts per million. So That's a big gap, and a ventilation will help with that. So will keeping your brooder clean, dry, and warm. When we see things in the brooder, like in that 7-day, 14-day time frame of coccidiosis, necrotic enteritis, those things, they're 100% preventable by keeping a dry, clean brooder. And if you have a wet spot by your waterers, or any kind of caked spot in your brooder, you need to get it out every day. If you has a hard time keeping wet, having a hard time keeping it dry and keeping water off of it, or cake spots, you got to put in the extra effort to get that stuff out of there. Remove the wet, add the dry, and you'll be rewarded with healthier birds. And this period in the brooder, if you have those cool nights and you have where your heat is maybe not so well and doesn't function right, they can get stressed out, get a condition called ascites, and that doesn't usually show up and start killing your birds until like week 5 and 6 and 7 and all the way into processing. But that usually happened inside the brooder, and you usually see it because the birds are purple in extreme cases, and the cavities, the abdomen cavities, fills up with fluid, and eventually it kills the birds. So brooder management there is very, very critical. And because one of the challenges pastured folks have in a brooder environment is we tend to use a lot of passive ventilation. We don't have a big fancy barn with automated air ventilation systems to keep everything just right. We're relying on basically passive ventilation, which sometimes doesn't work, sometimes it works. But that's why, maintaining a very comfortable stocking density, paying attention to your bedding is pretty important. And in terms of stocking density, lay it out here in the brooder. For broilers, like the Cornish cross Freedom Rangers, if you plan on having, about 1 square foot per bird when they're 3 weeks old, which is about the time they are going to go out to pasture, you're good. And people certainly do it with less than that, but the comfortable, proven metric is 1. Layers, that 1 square foot at about 7-6 weeks old, maybe 8. Turkeys 1.5 square foot at 4 weeks. So sounds like a lot, but when you put these birds out on pasture, they're going to be getting similar spaces, and that's part of how you keep them healthy. And because the brooder is so important, we'll spend just a few more minutes here. There's a popular idea out there that we brood turkeys and broiler chickens together, because the Cornish cross geniuses will teach the dummy turkeys how to live. Okay. And that idea was popularized by, of course, Joel Salatin in his book. And it's still in play in a lot of farms today. But the reality is, even Joel has moved away from that model and broods turkeys separately in a cleaned out brooder, and reports having a lot better success with turkey mortality coming out of the brooder. So turkeys get this rap as one of those things that they just look for ways to die. But sometimes they just need a little more attention. They need you, the farmer, to be in the brooder with them throughout the day, interacting with them, getting them interested in the water and the feed. And if you keep them separate, I think you'll have a little bit better success brooding those turkeys than if you're commingling them with your chickens. And again, exceptions definitely apply, but this is some of the ways that work very well. So if we move our next phase, then we go from brooder to pasture management. Then some of the critical things we need to think about here is predation. It really kind of gets under my skin when I take a phone call from somebody or talk to somebody who is raising birds outside on pasture, and they have a predation problem. And we all have those problems. But when I ask, well, what are you doing to prevent those predators from getting into your birds? And they're like, well, I let the birds run around, meaning there is no protection. So we, as shepherds of our flock, need to take the time and account for predation control. And there's a couple ways to do that. One way is shelter design. Simple daily move shelters. Like if you got meat birds, putting them in a shelter, whether it's a hoop house or one of the Salatin style shelters, but confining them to their shelter, giving them lots of space, and moving them every day to new pasture, then that's a really awesome predator deterrent. Simple portable electric fencing, or if you have the permanent fencing in place, but perimeter fencing around where you're grazing those birds is also a good way to deter ground predators, through the night, the raccoons, the foxes, and things like that. And of course, when it comes to animals, livestock guardian dogs are usually the go-to predator defense for a lot of people in the pastured poultry community. I don't have a lot of experience with the dogs. I have run geese before, and it was they did very well in protecting my laying flock. I used to have some predation from great horned owls, and the loudness, the alertness of the geese seemed to have done the trick to make a lot of noise and deter those predators and their big bodies running around the eggmobile. So always you need to account for predators. It's a fact of what we do, but you can't overlook the predation and expect to have any kind of long-term success. It just doesn't happen, because that's one of the things that will quite literally kill you and your flock. The other things for pasture, you want to avoid that static run environment where, the birds are continuously grazing in an area. And, this is kind of the dirt lot poultry, right? No pastured poultry comes from a dirt lot. And that's one of the unsanitary environments that we run into, is where those birds are constantly manuring and maybe even eating feed off of the same dirty, pooped up environment. It's not a good foundation for health. The health comes from the fresh pasture, moving those birds away from their own manure. Whether you do that in a daily move, or whether you do that, inside a paddock that's shifted with your eggmobile. So coming back to that idea of the shelters, one of the ideas here is we already talked about the predator protection. Your pasture shelter should be able to be moved. Another requirement that you would want to consider here when you build a pasture shelter is it protective from the weather? So and a lot of times that simply means it's going to keep rain off of the flock. It's going to keep the wind out of the flock. So you have to account for drafts. It's going to create shade, because your broilers, your meat birds, don't like the burning sun. Your layers aren't going to really be all that thrilled with the midday sun either. They like shade. Turkeys, they're pretty flexible. They roll with it. But so you want that shade and to be designed into your shelter too. And that sometimes that means when you build your shelter, your hoop house, or your whatever it is, being cautious not to use greenhouse plastic. Even in the winter when you bring the birds in, if you use like a greenhouse plastic that lets intense light through, that they're not going to react well to that intense light, especially if it snows and the light shines off of that. It's going to drive those hens crazy in the winter. And they're going to go crazy by pecking each other and potentially stop laying. But those simple things, when you're building your shelter and putting birds out on pasture, is just making it comfortable. I always used to go out in my early years of raising, go out into my pasture in the driving rain and stand in it. So I would put a raincoat on, walk out there, stand in my hoop house and say, okay, am I getting wet? What are my birds doing? Are they staying dry? So I knew how they reacted in the weather elements, because they didn't have a chance to come inside the house. Their house, it either worked or it didn't. And if it didn't, usually that's a recipe for piling and other, stressful environments that could lead to health problems. Excuse me. And so this idea, when we talk about our pasture housing, we need to one of the common questions usually comes up is densities. How many birds do I put, and where and how often do I move them? And that's a kind of an involved question. It's really also kind of situational. So we can I'll talk a little bit about some generalities, and these are places to start. So when you're looking at pasture housing, let's start with the meat birds. These are the broilers, and generally going to start somewhere, assuming we're processing that bird at about 6 pounds live weight, which is 7 weeks, maybe, maybe 8 weeks to get a little bit bigger. But you're going to look at 1.5 to 2 square feet of space per chicken when it reaches that 7-8 week mark. And that gives them the space they need to forage, stay clean during the day while you move them. And if it's hot, like the heat of the summer, you might want to go closer to that 2 square feet to give them more ventilation and more airflow in the house. So, this is a little bit of situational, being able to observe your flock and seeing what's happening and make some adjustments to it. A lot of times people will process at 7 weeks or 8 weeks. So at 7 weeks, they may be running like 1.5 square feet, and then they pull half of that flock out, and then it gets a little bit more comfortable in there for the birds as they go into that extra week or so of growth. So then if you think about, and generally speaking, moving meat birds daily in that kind of environment is really we recommend it. That's a lot of, that is the original model. People day range meat birds, but, and some breeds will do better than others. Cornish cross, they tend to favor and do very, very well in that daily move shelter. And it actually helps, build the soil health and fertility very quickly in that kind of a setup too. So because every day you're getting a concentrated shot of manure in a different section of pasture. So laying hens are a little bit different story. Most people still put them in some kind of a range setup, whether that's in a portable fencing where the paddock gets shifted every 5-7 days, or there's people out there running eggmobiles where they basically are in a real honest free range environment where the eggmobile is moved like 100 feet every day, and they just go through the pasture like that. But there's some kind of bigger perimeter fence, but there isn't necessarily a paddock defined. So that's very doable, and housing density inside that eggmobile in that kind of range setup. I've seen it go from anywhere from like 0.1 to a third of a square foot to all the way up to people do 1 square foot here. And part of this will depend on your breed. Heavier breeds need a little bit more space. But basically, you want everybody to be able to roost inside of that eggmobile at one time and be in, out of the weather and under protection simultaneously. And you need to have nest boxes in there. So, those are the considerations really for your pastured egg housing. Is they need to roost, be protected from the weather, and have a place to lay their eggs. And if you got that, in addition to the range area, you're well on your way to having a good housing setup. If you're going to put your hens in a daily move, like some people are using the larger prairie schooners or mobile range coops, the 20 by 40-ish type setup, you can kind of factor on starting at somewhere maybe like a 3 square foot per bird if you're dealing with the hybrids. So these are a lot of numbers, and going through them kind of quickly, but just kind of jot them down. These are pretty reflexive numbers for most of us in the APPPA community. And like I said, some people will push these a little bit, but turkeys, again, having enough space for them to roost inside their range shelter. If you're going to move them daily, and house them over winter, it's kind of like a 4 pounds or 4 square foot per bird is a good starting point. Some general things to consider. I just delivered 500 ready to lay pullets to somebody, and he put them into the flock with 500 other birds from some other source. And I just got a call, within the last week or so that said, hey, I got some mortality in my other flock that I put your birds in with. And I wanted to know, is it possible? And he asked about a disease because his one flock was vaccinated with some stuff or not vaccinated, and the flock that I gave him was vaccinated. So he was wondering if they could carry the disease. And, other than helping kind of troubleshoot some of those problems, my first thought was, oh my goodness, you just commingled 2 disparate flocks. And if there's a problem, not only are you going to take out the 500 birds, but you're going to take out 1,000. So, simple things like quarantining your birds, and separating and making sure there's no disease issues with them is always a recommended thing. And flock rotation, especially with your especially with your layers, all in, all out flock rotation helps keep things healthy and happy. We'll kind of scoot through here for some of these. Fresh water, that should be obvious. Nobody likes to drink dirty water or water with bedding in it or manure or whatever else we manage to find in our waterers. Raising birds with full beaks, so this is one of those things you're like, what does that have to do with anything? But really, the reason birds, and we find this with the ready to lay pullets that we often source from contract growers, is they trim the beaks. And industry, of course, debeaks birds when they put them in their cages. But trimming and debeaking the birds is really a symptom of the management style, and cramping those birds into a space where they are too stressed to live. So they peck each other, and you trim their beak or debeak them so that, when they peck their neighbor, it doesn't hurt anybody. So having an untrimmed beak is really a symbol of raising a bird to the best of their management, or to the best of their natural tendencies. And it's a marker of doing things in a more holistic way. So this idea of all in, all out, all this stuff talks about the disease and of course, the biggest disease risk we have here of late is highly pathogenic avian influenza, the bird flu. There's There's 2 articles referenced there on the APPPA website. If you're interested and you haven't seen them, I recommend you take a look at them, check them out. But generally, what we've known and what the most recent years have shown us is bird flu is primarily affecting the intensely confined birds where the viral load inside those houses is so great, there's no chance for any of the birds even coping with them. So once the virus gets into those barns, which it, when you're dealing with biosecurity that relies on human following things and trying to keep things out from the wind, for example, it's very difficult. So they're going to get into the barns. There's going to be contamination inside those barns. And once they do, those environments are great environments for spreading HPAI. And, that's just the numbers talking. You can look at the numbers. They don't lie. We have observable fact to back that up. It favors those intensely confined poultry houses more than anything else. Feeding and watering. What I want to focus on here, you can read the bullet points. Always feed a nutritionally balanced ration. Every poultry you have deserves grit. That's hard, insoluble granite, which, one of the big suppliers is Granite Grit, which supplies half of the country. If you need a grit source, contact me, but everybody has a size. Give it to them. Grit is different than oyster shell. Oyster shell is a calcium supplement you give to your layers to help them restore the calcium deposits in their bones. And that's soluble. So that goes into the digestive system and the bird absorbs it slowly over time. Grit goes into the gizzard and helps mash up the food and improve feed conversion and nutrient availability. All your birds should be able to eat at the same time. That's reduces feed competition. So we think of the idea of troubleshooting. You keep some records. So the best way to understand what your birds are doing is to know what they have done, so that you have some ideas of what is normal or what is usual. Take pictures, and always, 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 if you have a dead bird, open it up. If you don't know what you're looking for, the APPPA community is great for that. Somebody can help you do that, and your pictures can help you get some help that you need. And always make time to observe. Slaughter practices, one of the things that always drove me crazy when I was processing birds is people didn't withdraw their feed. Minimum 12 hours, 16 is probably more like it. But you want all that digestive stuff to go through their intestines and clear the bird. Because when you're processing birds, the last thing you want is a bunch of poop oozing out all over your evisceration table. If you're doing that, everything you've done to that point is for naught, because your biggest source of contamination is the manure. So getting it all out of the bird when they're still living is critical. Crate the birds at night under darkness. You'll save yourself a whole lot of heartache by doing that. And humane slaughter, we won't go into much of that we can talk a little bit about that if you have questions. And leverage your exemptions. These are the processing exemptions. The 1,000 bird, 20,000 bird producer grower type of exemptions that allow you to process birds on farm and sell them. It's a federal regulation. Some states make it incredibly difficult. Other states, enable the process. So unfortunately, it depends on where you live, but it's a great way to get birds into the market. And I'll just pause here and let you kind of take this in. You'll have this for reference. Apple cider vinegar, though, is one of my go-to defenses for anything. So you can see the dosage there. If I'm going to use it as preventative, I want to prevent, say, heat stress when it's 85 or 90 degrees outside. I add a little bit of apple cider vinegar to my water. If I start running into problems where I see maybe I had some ascites and I see it, I want to add apple cider vinegar, 2 ounces to a gallon for a couple of days and treat that way. So it's whenever I notice problems, apple cider vinegar is my go-to, and then we figure out what else needs to happen from there. Okay, so I'm almost down to my last slide here. Want to talk just a moment on marketing, and then we'll take some questions. So one of the things that it's hard to, if you haven't been direct marketing poultry and eggs in the past, it's hard to understand or wrap our heads around the fact that we don't sell chicken, right? Some people will say that we sell solutions, solutions to hunger, whatever it happens to be. It might be a busy mom and you have a solution to a dinner that's quick, easy, and nutritious. It might be chicken or turkey or eggs that are raised in a specific way to meet a customer's demands. But really, you're selling a solution. You're selling your story in a lot of places. I know lots of people who say that they have customers simply because of who they are. Not that they're somebody important or famous, but they're relatable. They have a story, or they connect with their customers. So when you start thinking about raising birds ultimately becomes the easy part. You can improve how you raise and produce the chickens and get better at it over time. But we understand how to raise birds very, very well. And with a couple years, you will too. It's the marketing part that it becomes a little bit tougher for people. So figuring out who your customer is going to be, and then developing all your marketing around that customer. So one example I always like to put in here, because it's easy, is if you're targeting Weston A Price chapter members, they're going to be members who a lot of times seek out things like no soy fed birds. So if that's your buyer, then you market the fact that you don't feed soy. That's important. If you're the kind of person that likes soy and you like to use roasted soy and put it in your cereal in the morning, then you're not going to sell to the person who doesn't want soy. So you understand it's okay to not sell to everybody. You can't sell to everybody. You just need to figure out who that person is, understand them, and build lists of those people, and then stay in touch with them. That's the short version of email marketing, you might call it. But it really, any kind of marketing, whether it's podcasts or at the market or your brochures or your website, is all going to talk to this one person, this ideal person who's buying your stuff. Some simple acknowledgments. I spend a lot of time with a lot of great people in my local community. People like Jeff Maddox and Eli Reif have been instrumental to what I know about poultry, and the APPPA community has been, undeniably one of the most critical parts of where I've been able to start and come. Without that, I probably don't know half the things I do. So here we go. We'll wrap it up there. Leave a few minutes for questions, and
Thanks, Mike. This is Larissa again. I appreciate that you're quite thorough and insightful presentation. And so I think we're ready to take your questions. And I think a lot of you have already found the question area. There's a green question mark at the top of your screen where you can submit a question, and I'm going to read them aloud, and then Mike will respond. So I know a couple of them already came in during the presentation. So if you scroll down there. So we have a question about, do you suggest for protection in winter when electric fence, or what do you suggest for protection in winter when electric fencing is no longer workable? A permanent fence is not a solution in her case.
Yeah, so I always would assume and recommend that the birds come into like the barnyard environment. So maybe that's a high tunnel or a hoop house, or you have a permanent barn where the birds can be deep bedded with lots of space and fresh bedding. But if you are going to keep them out on pasture, that's a little bit tougher. I wouldn't recommend it, especially if you get snow. You got to trudge out there to tend the birds in the snow. Always bring them in closer, and then you can always put up a sacrifice lot with some temporary fencing if you need.
Okay, next question. Does APPPA have any recommendations or plans for pastured poultry shelters?
So that's a good question. There's a few designs posted on the resources section. Actually, I just changed the website. I think it's the resources section. Let me go look real quick. There's a few housing designs out there. Under resources. So, they range from the hoop house to the Salatin, and people are building their own much larger structures these days. So it's a frequent conversation topic.
There's also a request, Mike, that you please talk a little bit about having enough ventilation, but not having drafts.
Oh yeah,
the shelters. The brooder.
Yep. And so that, basically it's a kind of the way to think about it is drafts are going to be what would affect the birds at their level. So a draft would blow directly onto the birds. And if you, in your brooder, you might see that you have a draft if all of your birds are pushed against one wall. For example, that might indicate a draft, but ventilation is coming in over top of the birds and circulates up top.
Thanks, Mike. We have had a couple questions about looking at the slides again. And I just want to assure everyone that the slides will be available for you tomorrow. I'm going to email out both the audio-visual presentation as a whole and then the PowerPoint. So you can have those notes at your fingertips. But we'll keep going with the questions. Okay, next question is there a hybrid bird that works well for laying and meat?
Yeah, so you start looking at the heritage type birds, like maybe an Australorp or a barred rock would be those kind of birds. And when you get into the heritage birds, really, one way to think about it is they're all dual purpose because you got to eat the roosters because you're going to get, half as many roosters as you will pullets. So things like that, the Delawares people have used for both, Buckeyes being primarily a meat producing bird, but you're looking at those kinds of birds.
All right. So suggestions for major heat. This is from someone out of San Antonio, South Texas. I'm
sorry, what was that question?
They're looking for suggestions during times of extreme heat. Some of them, yeah.
So a couple ways you can deal with that heat. One is you don't raise assuming we're talking meat birds here, you don't raise the meat birds in your hottest time of year is one option. Not always practical. Two, you choose a bird that is well suited. Like there's some of the slower growing broilers like Sasso Naked Neck or Freedom Ranger, for example, or even the heritage breeds will do better in the heat. And then some of our larger producers like Cobb Creek and Winding Meadows family farm down there in Texas, they actually I don't know about Winding Meadows, but Cobb Creek runs misters inside of their range coops. So they mist their birds in the hot weather. So a couple of different options.
Next question is about continuous grazing. And so the question is, so continuous grazing is bad even if there are only 5 birds on a 50-foot by 50-foot pasture. Could you explain why that would be bad?
So if you have everybody in that section, 5 birds, you're probably gonna get away with it. Give it enough time though. Birds will always develop their favorite spots to go. So they're always going to wear specific areas down, and given enough time, they will ultimately turn grass into dirt. But if you're large enough and you only have a couple birds, you may forgo that. But generally, the trend is birds in the same area eventually turn grass to dirt.
Mike, do you have any pasture rotation solutions for large turkey flocks, specifically?
I'm not sure what the question is, but I'll take a stab. So one of the ways that I found that work really well for my turkeys, at least my broad-breasted when I raise them, because they're really easy to herd, is I like to run 2 parallel fences, and then with shorter cross fences and I'm using electric netting here, so portable fencing. And then when it comes time to move my birds, I pull the front fence up, drag the house forward to the new area, and then herd the turkeys into the area, put the fence in behind them, and then I already have a fence out in front of them. So I'm moving 2 cross fences down the length of my parallel fence. Works pretty well for me. That way I'm not trying to fight electric fencing after dark and my turkey's running all over the woods in my case. Never a fun time.
And Mike, could you repeat the name of the grit producer that you use?
So it's Granny Grit out of North Carolina. It's GRANI Grit. A lot of times the folks out of the Midwest will use a cherry stone or a cherry grit producer. I'm not sure who it's distributed by. It's not quite as hard, and it's also red. But those are the 2 primary options. But it's a hard grit, and the thing about grit that I didn't mention in the presentation is your birds almost never are going to find, I mean, I could say never, but there's always maybe an exception out there, 1 in 1,000. But your birds aren't going to find the grit that they need for their life stage on the pasture. If you go out and look at the pasture and you say, well, they'll just get the grit, go ahead and look in their pasture and see how much grit those birds actually have. They really do need it. It really does help their digestion, and it translates into more, more eggs and more meat.
Excellent. So we have time for just a couple more questions before we close. So the next question is, with an eggmobile setup, can you please describe the predation setup control?
So when I did a small eggmobile, I used my 2 things were electric fencing that was charged, it was hot, and then geese. So fencing is a part of it. I think usually in every situation, whether it's a wider perimeter or whether it's a smaller paddock, but then some kind of guard animal like a livestock guardian dog or geese in my case.
Next question, Mike. At what age do you process your heritage breeds?
So some of them vary. I know there's a producer out in California who raises Delawares, and she was getting 4.5 pound birds, I believe, in 14 weeks, which was pretty good. That bird's capable in its heyday of 12 weeks to market. A lot of times New Hampshires are going to be in that 16 to 18 weeks. And most of those heritage chickens will fall in that range. Turkeys are going to probably be in the 26, 28 week range, which is a lot of time.
And then right now, how do you handle mites?
That's a good question. I never actually had to handle any. So giving them a dust bath and trying to let them do it naturally. If you're having some mite problems, I would, if you have access to like wood wood ashes might be one thing, but you'd also build something with some peat moss and some diatomaceous earth. Just give them a chance to get in there and naturally work around that dust bathing. That's a natural tendency for them. They'll want to dust bathe, and they're doing it to keep clean, as odd as it may sound. So if you have that, first step I would do is give them a dust bath.
Excellent. Okay, so thank you so much, Mike. I just have a few housekeeping items before we sign off. As I mentioned, a recording of this webinar will be available. It will be archived on the FACT website, and I'm also going to email it out to you all along with any links and copies of the slides. Also, immediately after the webinar ends, you'll be asked to complete a very short survey about your experience. And if you had a question that we didn't get to, or you thought of after we ended the Q&A, you can type it in there and give us any other feedback on that survey. So a quick plug about our upcoming webinars. We have one next week. Please join us on next Wednesday for an info session. I'm going to be hosting about FACT's Fund to Farmer grants. And then the following week on November 8th, we have an expert organic grass milk producer who's going to be talking about how to go 100% grass-fed with your dairy herd. So like I mentioned earlier, FACT is currently accepting applications for our Fund to Farmer grants. They're due December 4th, so you still have quite a few weeks to apply. We have two types of grants this year, one for projects that would increase access to well-managed pasture for your animals, and a second for projects that would help farmers attain one of several certifications. So check out our webpage, attend the info session next week, and apply online. So again, a sincere thank you to Mike for your really excellent presentation and for taking the time to answer, so many of our questions. And I also like to thank all the members of our audience for your attention and interest. It was certainly been my pleasure to host this webinar. So I hope that you all enjoy the rest of your Tuesday evening and that we connect again soon. So thanks again. Thanks, Mike. Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks, Larissa.
Yes, talk to you soon. Bye.